Okay, I think we're going to get going. I'm extremely excited by this. As you can see, the title, Encore with Dr. Peter Doms. And I can't believe that it was 2022 that we did the first one of these, Peter, but it
Yeah.
was. And what's to me cool about this, for those of you who weren't in that first session or maybe who didn't watch the webinar, is that through a series of conversations, and I think Peter was also, I think you were also in the practitioner program, if I remember,
Yes, correct.
sort of this whole thing about accomplishments came to the fore. And then Peter made his, and we started looking together at strategic planning out there in the world on Google and such, and realizing that the range of how people do it, first of all, but also how people define strategic objectives was not very consistent, and that there were a lot of them were activity rather than things you could accomplish or work outputs or accomplishments. And so to me, that was stunning, because I don't understand how you plan against activities to get done. How long do you do them and so forth? But anyway, we started this conversation. And so Peter started changing what he was doing, and we have these frequent conversations, and it's been that many years. And so I realized when we were figuring out what we were going to do for our April webinar, I realized, wait a minute, we need to do this and hear what Peter has learned. So that's kind of where we're at. And Peter will, the way we're going to go about this, I'll show you the agenda in a minute, is I'm going to kind of provide an overview, and then Peter's going to talk about some summary stuff, and then we'll have hopefully a discussion with you all. But before we get into this is the next session, next May. And if you want to register, if you're not registered for it, you can point your phone at that QR code, and it'll get you to the registration thing. But every once in a while I realize that there's some things we sort of take for granted, and we present or overview or whatever in these webinars, but some of the stuff we take for granted is pretty interesting. So I realized, why we love the performance chain is going to be the topic next month, because it's a very simple framework that actually is pretty powerful. So we'll be talking about that, and I'm excited about it. And by the way, if you are registered for this one, you'll get a notice for the next one automatically, I'm pretty sure. So, but can never be too sure. So you can register again if you want. So this is what we're going to do today. I'm going to provide kind of an overview for people who are not familiar with our work, who maybe don't really know what we mean by accomplishments. I'm going to do that as quickly as I can. And then Peter's got a great presentation about sort of at a high level what he's learned and what he started doing since we spoke in 2022. And he can introduce himself and talk a little bit more about his background when he has his part of this. And this includes, really interestingly and importantly, a lot of strategic planning people sort of, parachute in, do a thing, leave the plan, and go away. Well, as you learn, Peter started doing this follow-up, helping people stay on track, helping people execute. And I think it's a big deal. So he's going to tell us kind of at a summary level what he's learned so far. And then we hope to have about half of the time to just have conversation between us. And then we're going to have some time to see if you all have some things to say. So that's where we're going with this. Now, as most of you who are familiar with our work, and certainly the main names that I see here, now you realize that we are accomplishment based. We follow in the lineage of Tom Gilbert and Joe Harless, who were great pioneers in the field of performance improvement. And the famous statement that I've probably cited 4,000 times or something like that in the last few years is from Tom Gilbert's book, Human Confidence. In the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. And what he means, he doesn't mean some, just behaviorists or something like that. He means everybody, that we tend to look at activity, our own activity, others' activity, when we were living on the plains of Africa or whatever, the predators or the other tribes' activity. We pay attention to that because we got to respond to it. But when we get beyond very concrete outputs or accomplishments like, documents or widgets, we're not very good at identifying and defining the products of behavior. But as Tom said in the second half of the statement, we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior, which reminds me of something I occasionally ask people: have you ever been in a meeting that didn't produce anything of value? So the whole approach that we take, again, following this lineage, is we really anchor it to accomplishments. And I coined the term about 15 years ago or so, work outputs. And the reason I did that, different of our pioneering thought leaders have used the word outputs in different ways. But the reason I did that is because if you look out into the field of performance improvement or behavioral systems, people use the word accomplishments, but they often don't mean the same thing as other people mean. So sometimes they really describe them as just the completion of activity. And I don't want to know just what the procedure got completed. I want to know what it produced, because that, as Tom pointed out, is what's valuable. So we focus on that. And we have this simple model of performance chain that we're going to talk about next month in more detail. But we basically sort of anchor everything we do to those outputs, because those are the valuable things. We can count them. As it says there, we can define criteria for a good one. So we know if the widget or the relationship or the document or the recommendation or the prototype, whatever it was, the thing is a good one or not. And if it is, it credibly contributes to business or organizational results. And also, once we identify those, we can figure out what the behavior is needed to produce it. So it's really at the core of this stuff. And of course, using the performance chain model, it works from the left to the right, and we analyze it more or less from the right to the left. So that's kind of the framework. But again, work outputs or accomplishments are the main thing. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the big aha, if you will, was when we had this conversation years ago, really now, was, there's a difference. When people do strategic planning, they probably ought to have their objectives be things that you can define whether they've been accomplishments. So with that, let me turn it over to Peter, and he can introduce himself and take it from here for a few minutes.
Thank you, Carl. Yes, I've been in this business of strategic planning for over 20 years now, and my background educationally is that I have a degree in applied behavior analysis with an emphasis on systems. And part of that led to me working with organizations that needed strategic plans created, and so I started pivoting to that, and have been doing this for over 20 years and have probably created over 100 strategic plans for a number of organizations. One of my favorite clients was NASA, and then some airports and a lot of nonprofits. So while the organizations are different, the process to a large extent is very similar. And the slide that I'm showing you now, some of those slides I go through with my clients before we write the strategic plan, so to get them actually also accomplishment based. And the whole conversation started out with Carl when we talked about the execution of strategic plans and how we can make those easier. So the first slide right here says that strategic planning is still a popular management approach. It's one of the top 5. It was at least in 2013, and is used widely in many, many organizations. And I tell my clients, you can't go wrong doing strategic planning, because it will make your organization more effective, more efficient, regardless of how many strategies you have. And that's what I see all the time, that organizations that complete a strategic plan, they're better off than if they would not have executed a strategic plan. So, but what we find out is, and what the literature is full of, is that there's an execution problem. You can see the slide there and the quote from Tony Hayward, the CEO of BP. So you think of BP being this huge conglomerate with endless resources. So you figure if they get a strategy, they can execute it. But what you see here is that the problem is with execution. And many corporations have strategic management offices where people just work only on creating and implementing strategies. So my clients do not have strategic management offices. They're on their own. So what is it that we can do to help them with execution? And so what we do about it is the following. So I help my clients link strategic goals to business results. And I'll talk more about that in a second. This kind of outline. All right, strategic objectives as accomplishments, and we get to that. Specify clear deadlines and responsibilities. And what is new, what I have learned, and we'll get into that, is that I provide implementation support for my clients after we complete the strategic plan. I have implementation tools create it for my clients, and then sometimes coaching is really an extension of the strategic planning, because you become a trusted advisor when you do strategic planning within organizations, where they kind of give you the good, the bad, and the ugly about what's going on, so you can create good strategies. So here's the slide again with Tony Hayward, and we might be able to make the plan easier to execute. So look at the plan rather than the execution problem, and say, how can we make the plan so that we don't have lots of execution problems at hand? So Carl and I were talking, and there's design for manufacturing, which means that during the design phase, there's engineers, advanced manufacturing engineers, already working on the design side with the R&D people, and they're representing the manufacturing plant. And they say, well, if we use this material, we have these issues. If we use that, they can make production faster. We have less better quality in the first pass than if we do something else. Or maybe they also know about what's coming back from the field. So having advanced engineers sitting at the design table makes the manufacturing easier. So what do we do? So we can do the design for strategy execution for the strategic plan, to design it so that it's easier to execute. And that's really the point that I'm trying to, where I use accomplishment-based strategic planning. So first of all, link strategic goals to business results. I tell my clients strategic goals should express a business result, something that's really important for the overall organization. The results should be achieved via multiple strategic objectives, and I'll show you what that looks like. So a goal table out of my playbook. And then strategic goals should directly contribute to the mission and vision. So if you ask, why is this goal important? The answer should be because it helps us achieve our mission and move toward our vision. So what are some common business results? So this is based on the 4 perspectives of the Balanced Scorecard, developed by Kepler Norton in the mid-90s. And they said for a strategic plan to be viable and be really valuable, you have to have 4 perspectives, not just the customer perspective or the shareholder perspective, but also financial perspective, innovation, learning, and you have to have internal process perspective with specific business goals. So this is some of the results. Doesn't mean that a strategic goal is just, say, increase revenue diversity, but it should be related to revenue, for example, in the financial sector or with customer satisfaction. So there's a lot of different ways you can express strategic goals and have them function as business results. So then the second way I help my clients with is to write strategic objectives as work outputs. So work outputs are valuable work outputs are what individuals, teams, and processes contribute to the organization. So accomplishments are these work outputs, and they're a thing. So work output is a thing. It's something that's tangible, that you can count. It's a credible contribution to the business result or to the strategic goals. And it's the result of activity, not the activity itself. It is really what is produced. And Carl talked about Gilbert's cult of behavior. So we're trying to get away from that. There may be verbs in there, but what's produced is also stated. And the work output should be accountable now. So this is what I tell my clients when we begin writing the strategic plan. So here's some examples. On the left side, we have what I call vague objectives, and then on the other hand, accomplishment-based objectives. There's this whole notion of vagueness in strategic planning when strategic objectives are formulated in a way that they really leave a lot of room for interpretation and not very crystal clear what's supposed to be accomplished. So I've seen objectives like improve communication. Well, that makes sense to some people. Yeah, we need to do that, but how? What is the deal there? So one way to do that is to turn that into an accomplishment-based work output, like a communications plan that improves communications with stakeholders. So the beauty of a plan is that you have an outline of, you can write out what you want to accomplish, how you go about it. You can have different iterations, and you can improve it over time. So that's really critical, that the product becomes better as time progresses and things get updated. Another vague objective would be to clarify roles and responsibilities. I have clients where sometimes as they're growing a lot, roles and responsibilities become more unclear. People took on different hats in the beginning when there were only few employees, and now they have to refine those. And so they say, let's clarify roles and responsibilities, which is great. But in accomplishment-based language, I suggest to them something like create a job profile that details the roles and responsibilities for client-facing positions. So it's really something that, again, is a written work product that can be used by many people, that can have a lot of clarity inside of it, and it can be improved over time. And lastly, from an airport, there was, when we did the workshop, they said we need to explore a building, a crosswind runway. So that's when airplanes land, they have a second runway to get to. And so when we started writing the plan, I asked them, what do you want to explore? What's the result of your exploration? So how do you know when you're done? And they said, really, what we want to do is we want to decide whether to build a crosswind runway. So the accomplishment-based objective became a decision whether to build a crosswind runway. Now, one thing I want to say is when I run my strategic planning workshops and we brainstorm objectives, we get a lot of things that are on the left side. They get vague, and I do not critique people. I just want to get good ideas on paper. And then when we get a smaller group to write those objectives, we focus on accomplishment-based and work results. So that's where the critiquing comes in. Otherwise, I really reinforce their behavior of making contributions in during the sessions. Here's an example of what I call a goal page, and that is it lists the goal and lists strategic objectives with the numbered items and has target dates and leads. So in this case, from the airport plan, this goal, airport property is fully utilized, links to the business results of utilization and revenue. And next we have objectives as work outputs. So the numbered items and the bold items are the work outputs that were generated during the planning sessions. And one is an advertising plan. Another one would be a process, a determination by the FAA. Again, we see a decision in number 3, a map in 4A and 4B, and then more decisions. And even a list of gaps like you have in 5A, is a work product because it's tangible and it is something that is not just the behavior. So even though you see that we have accomplishment-based objectives, some of the numbered items, there is a verb in there, develop a map, so that sometimes flows better for my clients. They say, well, we have to create a plan, we have to write the plan. So we sometimes put that in there. Next, it's very important to make the plan more easier executable, is to have clear deadlines and responsibilities. I've seen many strategic plans where they have objectives, some of them maybe even sounded good, but then they don't specify target dates or leads. The target date is just the deadline by when you want to accomplish your work output, your work strategy there. And the lead is the person who is in charge of the objective. Doesn't mean it's the doer. It really means it's the person who is taking the objective and works with a team, with a committee, a cross-functional team. Maybe the lead writes a draft that's then reviewed by other people. So it's very important for a strategic plan to be easier to execute, is to make sure you take the guesswork out of by when it should be done and who should do it, because otherwise people will pawn it off to a colleague and nothing gets done. So what I have also established over time is a transition support that came also out of conversations I had with Carl. And so how to support organizations once we have the plan done. It used to be that I just give them the final plan and then turn them loose. And based on the execution problem, I found that it's very helpful for them to have some support in the transition from planning to execution. So I have a form that allows helps people to transition from strategy development to strategy execution. And that form lists a strategic goal, the objective, the target date, and the lead that the person is the objective a person is responsible for. They fill in that information, and then the form requires people to define criteria for good. So in the case of the decision for the crosswind runway, what makes it a good decision? So that those criteria are then developed by the people who are implementing it. So why don't we define the criteria when we write the plan? Well, the plan may have 25 objectives, and if you can imagine how much time it would take to develop criteria for good, it would take a very long time before the plan is done, and you might not have the right people at the table. So in this case, the people who are in charge of the objective, they can bring the right people to the table and make sure they have the subject matter experts there to develop the objective. And what this work form does too is break strategic objectives into smaller work outputs, project milestones. So again, with building the crosswind runway, there's certain steps that have to be going through to make a determination whether a runway is needed or not. And those are the project milestones. So it becomes a mini plan, so to speak, for the objective. So a mini strategic plan or work plan to do this. And my clients find this very helpful. Some put those worksheets on a shared drive so everybody can see where somebody's at. I've seen others print out the form and use them by hand and just fill in by hand and follow the handwritten outline. Then in some implementation support, what I do, I meet quarterly with my clients, typically a quarter to 4 months after the strategic plan has been completed or approved by a board of directors. And so my support is really there to be available all the time for questions, and people get stuck, that they call me, or we can get on a Zoom call and try to get them unstuck. And after 2 or 3 of these quarterly, when we end the quarter with a review where we meet for 90 minutes with the steering team, and we go over all the different objectives and see where they're at. So it's kind of like a status report for the entire strategic plan. And sometimes clients feel very comfortable meeting on a quarterly basis. Sometimes clients feel like, you know, with the progress we're making, it's good to get semi-annual strategy reviews. And the benefits are that it really establishes accountability. What I've heard from CEOs or executive directors is that it allows them to be more accountable to an outside person, even though they may have a board of directors, but a CEO may not have a board. And so they say, we have this meeting with Peter coming up, so we better make sure that we are on track with our strategies. So that's really a great deadline for them to have these quarterly meetings. And during those 90-minute strategy execution reviews, leaders review what they have accomplished in 1 quarter. And even though at the beginning of the meeting, they say, well, we didn't really get a whole lot done, you know, we can probably be out of here in 30 minutes. But without fail, those meetings last 90 minutes. And people say, wow, we got done much more than I thought. Because they see it all from everybody combined, not just only maybe what they have worked on. And that really refreshes the motivation and the enthusiasm for the strategic planning process and for the continued strategic plan implementation. It's really a fresh win for board members who participate in those sessions, also appreciate it because they really see what's happening in the organization. They find that very valuable. And what that does, the sessions also build a strategy tracking repertoire in the leadership team. That means they can now on their own during leadership sessions talk about where they're at because they're used to talking about progress and what to look for and what barriers perhaps to look for in the implementation of the objectives. So I also have a implementation support tracking form. It's here it is. It's a spreadsheet that is sortable, and it lists the strategic objectives by numbers. It lists the target dates and the leads. And so it's really implementation schedule. And what we do during our reviews, and what I encourage my clients to do, is add a column to the right of those three other columns. And in those, they provide their updates. Even when we have our quarterly meetings, I'll be often the one who is filling in the column for the updates. And when we have another review, then those columns move to the right. So the update column moves to the right. And that way, it really creates a way for tracking progress over time, because those columns don't fall off the sheet. They stay to the right and can be used to go back for perhaps future past decisions that have been made. And it's a very easy spreadsheet to use. And often those are also put in a shared drive so that leads for objectives can make their updates in real time. And like I mentioned, with the update columns being moved to the right, and we keep the history of the progress, and that is sometimes very valuable for the leads, and also when they bring on new team members, they can kind of go through the history and see how something evolved to this place where it's at right now. And then, like I mentioned earlier, people really see what they have accomplished, and wow, I hear that a lot. So we accomplished a lot. It's really something that people say, and that keeps these sessions also valuable for my clients. It's not only telling me what they did and I sound it back to them, but it's really helpful, and it's helpful for them to have somebody walk them through the process so that they have a record of their strategic planning execution process and progress, which is really helpful. Also helpful for those who report to a board. They can refer to that as a potential report. Sometimes implementation support leads to coaching, and the reason I say that is because as a strategic planning consultant, you become a trusted advisor to the leadership team, because they share with you what's working, what's not working. They sometimes, when we have one-on-one telephone calls during our quarterly period, they share issues maybe they have with staff, that staff are not on board, or that there may be some people not pulling their weight. And so that really is something that I find very encouraging, that I can function as a coach. And so this is, again, with the airport director, I just use that as an example that goes through my presentation. So they were looking at succession planning, and I suggested that we start out with creating this individual performance map. It's probably too small for you to read, but and Carl has talked about this multiple times. It's just a diagram that shows in these little boxes the customers that the position has, and then what are the accomplishments or the work outputs that are created for the customers. And with these, I've done those for several leadership staff at the airport and with other organizations. And there you too get a wow, because it's for the very first time that people kind of really list what they're accomplishing, not necessarily what they do all day long, but what do they accomplish, and how other people are using these. So this is something that came out, and we've been doing this coaching for several years now. And this led into succession planning support. So I did this with other airport staff. And then we used that to create a succession planning tool, where we list the customers on the left side, and then we have timelines in the columns. And they take just the work outputs and put them into the column by when the successor should be able to be fluent in those producing those different work results. So based on that, they created a succession plan that doesn't have a lot of pros in it. It's really focusing on these tables, which makes it very easy to follow the thinking with respect to what successors have to be able to accomplish and in what time frame. So I think that was my last slide, Carl. So there
Fantastic.
we are.
Okay, well, we can. Oops, I thought I put the slide in about you and I get to talk, but we do. But I just want to say a few things based on what you said. Every time we talk, or certainly with this thing, there's a lot of people who talk about things like strategic planning, but I always see when you describe why and how you use some of these tools, the sort of depth of wisdom you have. You've done this a lot. You've seen all this stuff that can kind of go off track and everything. And so I really appreciate that. And there's a bunch of interesting things. One of them, to me, is toward the end there, where you talk about coaching. It's a really, we've done this executive coaching thing with senior leaders often, where we do the individual performance map, and then we start having discussions with them about, how their contributions are. What's the most important stuff? What do they spend the most time on?
Mm-hmm.
Do they have a succession plan or a delegation plan, et cetera? And it seems to me beautiful that you've adopted this as an extension of strategic planning, because as you said, you're going to be pretty close to these people, right? You're going to really be a trusted advisor. So I just thought that, almost from a commercial business development point of view, I was thinking, well, there's a lot of roles, a performance consultant, but certainly a strategic planning a facilitator and consultant like you can add this executive coaching thing onto what they do in a way that really delivers a lot of value. And I thought that was kind of interesting. In a certain way, your execution stuff, because you're just following the performance, what we teach in performance thinking and all that. And I realized about halfway through your talk that really you're just talking about performance improvement for leaders. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. You're helping them get clear on expectations. You're defining criteria. You're managing it. And I thought that was pretty interesting. One other thing that you said toward the beginning about business results, as you know, the way we talk about it in performance thinking, in the performance chain, we say, well, accomplishments, if they're valuable, and that's what Tom Gilbert talked about, valuable accomplishments, they credibly contribute to business results. And so in this context, in a lot of projects we do as performance consultants, we definitely start out saying, what's at stake here? Why are we doing this? Is this for revenue or customer satisfaction or productivity or safety or whatever? And then we move on. But here it seems to me, because you're working on the strategic business plan, you're really, really connected with the business results. And so that link between accomplishments or work outputs and results seems really important, but also just a natural part of the process. So that I just was struck by that this is something we say a lot, but you get to really do it in a pretty substantial way with the leaders. One other thing too that I was thinking about, our shared background. We're trained in behavior science, as you said when you introduced yourself. And of course, applied behavior scientists talk about positive reinforcement. And when you talked about the wow experience, when you go in with these guys and, in your review and they say, well, Peter, we didn't get much done, and then you go through this thing and they see that they got a lot done. There's a natural positive reinforcer in there. You didn't have to say, "Oh, I'm going to give you an M&M because you did that." You put them in touch, with the positive consequences of their work, which I think is a really important thing. I think it's, as I think you probably know, I've always thought from a performance thinking perspective that extrinsic consequences can be fine, but I would much rather enable people to make contact with the natural payoff, and you do that beautifully. Let's see if there's any other. That's the main thing. Oh, the only other thing, two other comments that I just thought were worth highlighting because you said them really clearly. But one is, you're talking about Norton and Kaplan and the balanced scorecard, and those four categories that you use are sort of their standard model.
Correct.
But what I've also seen in the Norton Kaplan kind of balanced scorecard view is that sometimes for some types of organizations, there's some other categories than those four. And what I'm wondering is, have you encountered any of that, or is pretty much everything you've been able to, you do with clients kind of sort into those four boxes, if you will?
Pretty much all the goals that we develop fit in those four categories.
Okay.
And I know that Kaplan Norton were following corporations, and they realized that the corporations really mainly had shareholder linked strategic goals, to increase the value to the shareholders. But like I said, Kaplan Norton were talking about that in order to achieve that, you have to make sure that you service your customers really well, and that you have employees that are innovative, that try new things, that can manage the processes needed to provide the results for the customers, so that they drive the financial gain. And so the one thing where this is turned a little bit upside down is when I work with nonprofits. I mean, the financial gain is not what they're looking for. The finances are just what's supporting their mission. So they're really focused on the mission rather than on creating revenue. But I still can use those four categories. And what we do when we have a strategic plan just about ready to go and have it drafted, we go through the 4 perspectives from the balanced scorecard and say, are we hitting these with our goals? And often one goal may hit several perspectives. It happened before a couple of times that we said, oh, we just don't have a process goal or a customer focused goal. And then we looked around and we were able to move things around to where we did have one.
Well, that's interesting.
Apparent, yeah.
So it's kind of a completeness framework in a certain way. The part of the reason I asked about that is if you Google balanced scorecard, you'll see versions of it that have more than those 4 categories. And I'm also reminded Roger Kaufman, who was kind of an important mentor to me in some ways, who did a lot of work on needs analysis and strategy, and he used to talk about mega, right? And he was saying way back when nobody was talking about this, that every company should also have a societal level purpose or goal or mission or whatever. And I was struck that in the modern era, you think about a company like Apple, who is committed to having 100% of their energy be renewable energy from sources, as an environmental contribution. And so I could easily think of another, you could probably figure out how to put it in those 4 categories, but I could easily think of, in the sort of 21st century, there being another box, which is somehow societal contribution or something like that. But anyway, it's kind of neat that you can do that as a completeness thing. And then there was one other thing that I thought that I really liked, and to me this reflects kind of your pragmatic wisdom based on experience, which is that you were saying that when they have those vague descriptions, the behavior stuff, you're hands off, you brainstorm it, you people would say green light it, instead of like suppressing and like, no, that's not good enough. And I thought that was a really beautiful example in a way of design thinking, because what you're doing is you're doing, as I say, ideation, and you don't want to slow that down, and you create a lot of stuff. And then presumably they sort of select those or whatever, and then you say, okay, what is the product? So my question is, did you ever in your history have a time, well, I bet you didn't, because you've only started doing this accomplishment thing explicitly for a few years. But I'm wondering if you've ever had a time in your work in this strategic planning stuff where you did inadvertently kind of punish things and suppress things and learn from that, or have you just kind of been clear that that wasn't a good thing to do from the beginning?
No, actually, I learned the hard way one time, or a couple of sessions. When we used to brainstorm objectives, first I would do a particular activity which would shake out the goals, the goal statements. And at that time, people would make suggestions, and I say, well, that's not really a goal. So I try to get them to formulate it correctly instead of just taking what they had. And those discussions kind of took the joy out of it for the participants. And I realized that we don't need that, because after the workshops, we have a smaller group that really cleans things up. And so when you saw in the vague examples, those were ideas created during the workshops of how we can tackle a certain goal, perhaps. And that's where I'm really interested in ideas. And then when I meet with a smaller team that gets to see this PowerPoint deck in a similar form that I've shown here, they are the ones who would translate from maybe what are behaviors into work outputs.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I've learned the hard way in other contexts about that. As you know, for sure, I'm kind of a nitpicker. And part of it is that in performance thinking, like the example you're using where you say an output is a countable noun, I insist on that, and I make a big deal of it beforehand. But usually what happens is when people begin to do their analysis, guaranteed there's a whole bunch of stuff in their list of accomplishments or work outputs that have verbs in them, but I don't sort of attack those, if you will, until they've kind of got their list. And then I say, well, could we turn that into a countable noun or get rid of that verb? Because otherwise it does suppress, people get uptight, and especially if you're a nitpicker like I am, you got to be careful about that.
I still use verbs, but they lead then to the creation of a work product. So, for example, people may say, increase marketing. So, what does that mean? So, we may say, develop a marketing plan, or that does this. But the marketing plan is still the work output.
Well, when you said that before, one of the things that I was reminded of recently, and I think there's some people, certainly probably Don and Scott Mills and a few other people who are in the group here, know about Bob Mager's criterion referenced instruction. And I always think about the fact that Bob, he talked about behavioral objectives. A lot of educators and training people know about Mager as the guy who had this sort of template for doing behavioral objectives. But then he also did criterion referenced instruction. A lot of times it's being, for example, in factory environments or manufacturing environments, where you'd have a list of things that the learner or the employee had to be able to demonstrate they could do. And sometimes it wasn't formal training. Sometimes you'd go shadow somebody and come back and you learned how to do that or whatever. But they would be able to check them off. And what I realized was, there was a period of time where I was saying, well, yeah, Bob Mager had behavioral objectives, but we're better now because we learned from Gilbert and so forth about outputs and accomplishments. But what I realized was many of Mager's objectives were much like what you have, which is they have essentially produce a thing. So it's convenient language. But when they went in to do, I used a word, I forget what word you used, but you talked about how it was better way to talk, just from a language point of view. But the output's in there. And what I realized as I spoke with people and thought about it, is a lot of those criterion referenced items were exactly like that. They were behavioral objectives, but at the end there was a product. So that's how you knew. You looked at it and you said, yep, this is a properly adjusted machine or whatever the thing is. So I thought that was kind of nice thing that you pointed out there, that it's kind of another one of the anti-nitpicker guidelines, which is, as long as you've got a thing in there, we're not going to worry if the language has a verb in it. One of the things I wondered, because as you know, my history with accomplishments in our practitioner program and our coaching program is that's really hard. It's hard to get people to think about that sometimes, at least in the context I'm doing it. And, you can have discrimination in my training work, you can have discrimination exercises. Is this a behavior output? And they can get that all right. And then you ask them to go out and collect some stuff and they come back supposedly with outputs. And you say, like, where did these verbs come from? And there's a point where people get it sometimes, and sometimes it's quicker than others. So what I'm wondering is, as you're trying to move people in this direction, is that challenging? And if so, do you sort of see the light bulbs go on sometimes, or what does that look like in your work, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's a great question. So before we sit down to take those the raw output from the workshops, the stuff that I capture on flip charts, and that might be some more of these vague objectives, I go through the PowerPoint, and people can ask questions, and then we go to the first goal table and go to the first objective and say, what is it you want to accomplish? And sometimes it's really clear, but I say, what is it that you want to have the result of this? Say, well, we want to have job aids, for example, or we want to have job descriptions, And so I say that's that's a work output. That's what we're looking for. And so I coach them along this way. And the neat thing is that sometimes people make improvement suggestions over the brainstormed, initially ideated objective, and somebody else might say, well, that's not an accomplishment. And so they self-edit, or they edit the group members, which is really great.
So and one of the things that's cool about what you do is you're working by definition with a collective, whether it's your beginning larger group or your small group. There's a collective intelligence there. So what you just described is a perfect setup for people learning with and from each other, that's kind of a cool context, because not everybody will get it instantly. Well, the other question is, I would bet at some point when you leave them, they get it. It's like, oh, okay, this is what we should be doing. Because the other thing that I'm struck by is when you move into your execution plan, it's not that different from just project management, classic project management with milestones and so forth. And at least good project managers usually have those milestones. You'd look at them and they would probably be outputs, not always, but sometimes. And so it's a very nice transition into the execution thing, it seems, once they get that output part. So let's see. We had a bunch of questions here, but you said so many things that are interesting. I'm trying to. You used the word accountable, and you talked about the leads. And I think we've talked about this before. I'm always reminded of Steve Jobs had a thing at Apple, and I think it was called Uniquely Responsible Individual or something. They had an acronym for it. But his approach was, on any given meeting, any given thing where there's an action plan to come out of it, he didn't want to just have a group or a team. He wanted to have a person who was, in the end, the buck stops here. So that's kind of what you're doing, clearly. But what I wonder is, a lot of times the word accountable makes people nervous. And it's like, if you don't get it done, then something bad will happen. And my bet is that's not how you do it. But how do you manage that accountability thing as you meet with people to follow up with them?
Yeah, interestingly, I started out by using the word accountable instead of lead, because that was what some of the strategic planning literature was suggesting. So I got pushback from my clients, or one or two clients, and they said, we don't use the word accountable around here because it has these negative connotations of punishment. And so I went to responsible, and that, worked for a while. And then I took over the term owner because one client used it, and I thought that makes sense, but it's not like they're really owning the objective. So then I used the term lead, which I heard from a client. So the clients really helped me shape my strategic planning repertoire to where it just really becomes clearer over time. And sometimes, I compare that to, the guy that you talked to said, why don't you call it the 6 boxes? And so
you learn from your clients.
That's right. So, and the way we keep those accountable is when we go through these quarterly execution reviews and somebody didn't get anything done, we just talk about, so what are you going to do next then? What is your intention to do next? It's not hold them accountable by just saying, well, man, you really screwed up here, but say, what do you think can be done? Because one of the things when we look at the barriers to implementation, in many cases, it's either they're understaffed or they don't have the time. Well, this really goes together. So that's why, they're really worried about hitting the implementation milestones. And I said, the dates are not cut in stone. Things change, staffing changes, budgets change, there come emergencies, for example. So it's okay to take the date and move it out, because in the end, what matters is that the objective gets done.
Yep. That reminds me, I think we've talked about this before, but longtime colleague and friend of mine, Tim Eskew, who isn't doing this work anymore, but at Intel, he was at Intel for something like 15 years. And he was there when the Pentium chip went bad, and it cost them $1 billion because they made some mistakes on it. And as soon as I am quiet, you should look at the chat box, because there's a couple of good questions from Scott and Erwin. But what I was going to say is, what they learned was typically on project management, when deadlines started slipping, people would typically, because they were afraid of punishment, basically, they would start hiding out and they would start cutting corners. Well, you do enough of that and you get a bad Pentium chip at the end of your R&D process. And so Bill Daniels helped them do this, but they moved into a thing to do exactly what you described. And Tim's book was called No Surprises Project Management. And what he said is, on a project thing, you meet weekly, you've got very clearly defined outputs or milestones, and who's responsible. And what he encouraged people was, as soon as you have any idea this is going to slip, raise your hand and let us all know, because then we can problem solve it. And what they learned over time applying that was that sometimes the final deadline might slip by a few weeks, maybe on some big project, but they still got it done. and they got it done with high quality and reliably without, cutting corners or skipping things. And so in the end, that was the right way to do it because it was exactly what you're describing. And I was just struck by the comparison there.
Yeah, I see
So,
Scott has a comment about postponing criteria for good till after you have the accomplishments and dates. Because as I said, that's part of the implementation using that implementation worksheet. And it never, so far as I know, Scott, it never went to any rework or revision of the expectations because the objectives are clearly stated. It's just what makes a good one. And sometimes when we write the implementation plan, not all subject matter experts are at the table. So when a lead needs to do create a product, a work product, they can get the people together from the organization that will be the subject matter experts, and that they can define what would be good criteria.
mm-hmm. That's a good one. I'm reminded of the fact, and this is what I say to people, and I think it's true, is that criteria are actually harder than accomplishments. Because the goal there, a good set of criteria are, we don't have to argue over whether they apply. It's crisp enough so that we can look at it and say, yep, this is a good one or not. And so that cuts through things like timely as a criterion. Like, what does that mean? By the end of the day or next week? And so my bet is that also, you're talking about subject matter experts, that whatever these outputs are, they need to refine those down to a thing which everybody agrees on. And what I wonder is if you've been able to kind of look over their shoulders as they do that, and if there's that kind of a, wait a minute, we can't tell whether that's actually true or not discussion ever about criteria.
So no, I'm not part of that conversation because that happens internally. But what I do is when I have this worksheet, I coach them through it. We'll take an actual objective out of their strategic plan that we just finished and say, let's practice how to use this worksheet. I know it's one-time practice. It doesn't really help them to become experts, as you know from your performance improvement workshops, practitioner workshops. It takes a while to learn, but at least that seed is planted.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So Erwin has an interesting question too about resistance to defining the end of year measure, et cetera. I don't know what you want to make of that, but
so typically when we use with a steering team, it's a leadership team creating those metrics and also the deadlines. So with respect to metrics, we often put in the plan to create a dashboard for the goals. So this will be done as part of the implementation. During the strategic planning process, we brainstorm key KPIs, and then they get refined with a dedicated group that is in charge of developing this dashboard. So I don't know if that answers your question there or not. So they know the output by then, yes.
Mm-hmm. One comment I have about Ibrahim's comment, and you may have something else to say about, but he mentions KPIs and OKRs. Now, I have some problems with OKRs because when I look out into Google world, I see a lot of OKRs, which they're really vague. They're not too different from some of the stuff you encounter. So I did a blog a few years ago on that issue saying, to me, what you ought to be able to define is we want to produce this accomplishment in pursuit of this business result. Because to me, the objective is the thing, and the result is the business result to which it ought to contribute. But if you look at a lot of OKRs out there on the web, man, they don't all look like that. So, but it seems to me that in the way you define your objectives, they're at least comparable in that respect, because you're saying we want to improve customer satisfaction, and so we're going to have a whatever plan to address that, or whatever it is. Does that make any sense to you, Peter, what I'm sort of saying about OKRs? So cool.
Yes, absolutely. I saw that as well. You can Google strategic goals, and there's some websites that say these are potential strategic goals, and you find out that a lot of them are behavior-based and even objectives.
Yeah, I know. It's when you told me about the airport. It's been a few years now, but when you said, I don't remember the word. I guess it was a different word than I used, but I always tell people about this, about your work. And I say, investigate whether we should build the second runway or not. I always say, like, how long you can investigate, man? It's a decision, isn't it?
You'd be surprised how often that comes up, and with different organizations, different groups, they say explore this or explore that. I let it go in the workshops, but then when we write the plan, we clean it up, and it requires them to be more precise.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing. Because of your execution that you're following up, we also have talked about the fact that a remarkable number of organizations will do their strategic plan thing, and then they kind of stick the plan in the drawer, figuratively or literally. And it's like, oh, we got a strategic plan now, but they don't do it. And what I'm struck by is that your process with them, where you follow up, allows these refinements to happen over time. It can be a little bit more of an organic thing, whether versus kind of fixed in stone. Is that true? Is that an accurate appraisal?
Yes, we can refine things over time. Yeah.
Yeah.
But,
and everybody probably learns from that, I would bet.
You would think so, right? But I don't know how much they necessarily learn from those 90-minute sessions, but at least they know they're on the right track and they're making progress. And it depends. It depends from organization to organization how long we have these execution support sessions. Like some are on a 3 months cadence, then fade it to 6 months, and then they say they're okay, and then we fade it out. It's others maybe have one and say, no, we can do this internally if it's more mature organizations or smaller ones with a smaller leadership team. So it's not really cast in stone that they have to have this, but the ones who do have it enjoy the benefits of it.
Yeah. Well, let me click through another couple slides and then see if there's any last points you want to make, and/or for our participants here who've been having some nice stuff in the chat box, if there's any last questions or points you would like to raise. So just to finish this off a little bit, this is kind of the shameless commerce thing, as the car talk guys used to say. But as probably most of you know, this being recorded, and it will be posted on YouTube, on our YouTube channel at performancethinking.tv. And there's a ton. This is our 50th. This is our 50th monthly webinar. I can't believe it, but
congratulations.
Anyway, it is. Oh. Yeah, thank you. Well, it just makes me feel even older. But anyway, and we have some study guides for some of these things. If people are interested in study guides for webinars that we haven't done them for, reach out to us, and we can reach out to info@sixboxes.com. So that's one thing. Then the other thing is, if you're watching this on YouTube, as we think people will, then please subscribe, share, pass it on. We're trying to get this information out. It's free to as many people as we can. But then the shameless commerce part, which is we teach performance thinking in practitioner program. The next group is starting in June 16th. It's kind of filling up now in a nice way, but there's a few more seats. So if anybody that you know is interested in being certified to being a performance consultant or performance professional using our methodology, you can sign up for that, and that QR code will get you to some information about it. And then, or the next cohort for the open program is in September. So that's just letting people know. And so, question is, I see Colin has the last comment here. What does it have to say? Maybe for Peter. So at least my understanding of what Colin's comment is that you have kind of a solution for this, because it seems to me that because you clarify the outputs, it clarifies what Colin's starting about. But I think that's at least my understanding of the question. Measurable outcomes and build a formal business plan. Yeah, so that's consistent with this. Or go ahead.
Yeah, right. When the supervisor provides a list of accomplishments, then the behavior is not as critical, as long as the machine keeps running, like you said earlier. As long as the outputs are there.
Yeah, my former partner used to say, she had this great phrase, which was, outputs liberate behavior. Now, you don't want to liberate behavior in a nuclear plant or someplace where you have to follow the procedures exactly to produce the whatever nuclear plant that's not going to blow up or something. But in a lot of settings, behavior can flex a little bit as long as you produce the thing. And I think that's a really important point. But the other thing about it is, our coaching program is exactly addressing the point that Colin is making, which is we teach people to sit down with the individuals that they manage, coach, or supervise, create an individual performance plan so they know what their jobs are, the example you showed of the leader, and they know what they're supposed to produce. And then the coaching process is like, well, what should we talk about this week? Which thing do we need to improve, or could we help you get able to produce for the next project or for your next career path step? And so this whole thing about being clear about expectations and then helping people achieve those expectations at every level, in my experience, is enhanced or improved by defining the outputs or the product of behavior. Irwin, and then last one up was to liberate behavior, but that's also bi-directional, so fair enough. Anyway, have you got any parting comments, Peter, of just summary things that this has made you think about?
Well, the one thing that I really grateful for is that you mentioned we had conversations for the last several years, and I went through the practitioner workshop, which I can only highly recommend, is that that it helps me to provide a better product to my clients. And so I'm really happy about that, because I can just, I can take them by the hand, so to speak, and ease the transition to the implementation and making plans easier to execute. So I don't hear a lot of these said when I check in with them that the strategic plan ends up on the shelf in some drawer. They're actively working it.
Yeah. Well, as you know, my commitment from the time I met Dr. Skinner when I was like 22 was to make the applications of his science available as broadly in the world as possible. So to me, to be, talking with and having our ongoing conversations with another behavior scientist who has taken this application in a very interesting way makes me happy, because it expands, it expands our capacity to make a difference. And I really want to thank the participants. We had a pretty robust chat discussion here, and again, this will be on YouTube within a few days, and I think we're done for the day. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Carl. It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome. All right, we're going to end it.